It's often claimed that the serial killer known to history as Jack the Ripper must have had surgical skills. In this episode of the House of Lechmere, I'm going to put that theory to the test. The suggestion that the murderer exhibited surgical skill primarily revolves around organ removal, but also his skill in incapacitating and killing his victims quickly and efficiently by accurately targeting the vital areas, particularly the main blood vessels in the neck. I will restrict this inquiry to the 5 so-called canonical murders, highlighting where this was brought up. I will rely on the medical and police opinion at the time, in other words, the opinions of the professionals who either saw the victims, studied the original paperwork, or spoke to people who did. What I'm not going to do is give you the views of modern doctors. They haven't obviously seen the bodies, nor know what was deemed feasible at the time. Their opinions cannot count as being equal to that of the witnesses that I will quote, and they're invariably given in support of a particular theory on a TV documentary, and so is tainted. Firstly, I'll examine each of the murders in turn. For the first victim, Mary Ann Nichols, Dr. Llewellyn, who examined the body, said very little on the matter, but the coroner, Wynne Baxter, said, with reference to the murder of Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman, which was based on Dr. Llewellyn's testimony,
those injuries, again, had in each case been performed with anatomical knowledge.
That knowledge presumably enabled the killer to cut the vital neck vessels quickly. With the next murder, that of Annie Chapman, in an internal report, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson of Scotland Yard stated that Dr. Bagster Phillips, the local police divisional surgeon,
gives it as his opinion that the murderer was possessed of anatomical knowledge from the manner of removal of viscera, and that the knife used was not an ordinary knife, but such as a small amputating knife, or a well-ground slaughterman's knife.
Swanson reiterated,
the only indication of the direction to find the murderer lay in the evidence of Dr. Phillips, which was in substance that the individual possessed some skill and anatomical knowledge, and that the instrument with which the injuries were inflicted was probably a small amputating knife or a well-ground butcher's knife.
When Bagster Phillips appeared at the inquest, he testified that the injuries suffered by Annie Chapman could have been done by such an instrument as a medical man used for post-mortem purposes, but that ordinary surgical cases might not contain such an instrument. Those used by slaughtermen, well ground down, might have caused them. Furthermore, there were indications of anatomical knowledge which were only less indicated in consequence of haste. The whole of the body was not present, the absent portions being from the abdomen. The mode in which these portions were extracted showed some anatomical knowledge. Dr. Bagster Phillips was called to testify again at a subsequent sitting of the inquest about a week later, as the coroner wanted him to go into more detail as to the specific injuries suffered by Annie Chapman, particularly with regard to the absent portions of the body. This was a euphemism for organ removal. Her uterus and the upper portion of the vagina and 2/3 of the bladder were missing, and Bagster Phillips had been too squeamish to go into these details at in his initial testimony. The witness proceeded to give medical and surgical evidence, totally unfit for publication, of the deliberate, successful and apparently scientific manner in which the poor woman had been mutilated. The mode in which the knife had been used seemed to indicate great anatomical knowledge. The coroner, in his summing up, confirmed this.
The injuries had been made by someone who had considerable anatomical skill and knowledge. There were no meaningless cuts. It was done by one who knew where to find what he wanted, what difficulties he would have to contend against, and how he should use his knife, so as to abstract the organ without injury to it. No unskilled person could have known where to find it, or have recognised it when it was found. For instance, no mere slaughterer of animals could have carried out these operations. It must have been someone accustomed to the post-mortem room.
And
his anatomical skill carries him out of the category of a common criminal, for his knowledge could only have been obtained by assisting at post-mortems or by frequenting the post-mortem room.
So at this stage, due to the influence of Dr. Bagster Phillips, there was a clear belief that someone at least associated with the medical profession was responsible. And later on, I'll discuss what influence this had on the police investigation. Wynne Baxter, in his summing up of the Annie Chapman case, referenced that he'd been personally hearing from what he called a sub-curator of a pathological museum that an American had been approaching that museum asking if he could buy for £20 a go specimens of body parts, specifically uteri. Wynne Baxter pondered whether this might have motivated a potential killer to kill these victims in order to harvest their uteri to sell to this supposed American uteri collector. This theory of Wynne Baxter's, which, as I say, mentioned in the summing up at the end of the Annie Chapman inquest, was ridiculed in the esteemed medical journal The Lancet. For example, they said, why would they pay as much as £20, which was a considerable sum in those days, for a uterus from presumably a body that was being used for medical purposes? And why not just get them in America? Why harvest them in London to send to America? It didn't stand up to scrutiny. This inevitably caused a bit of a interest in the newspapers, this suggestion of Wynne Baxter's, but follow-up news reports and reporters went around the various teaching hospitals in London, found that it was just a load of rubbish. It was a nonsense story from beginning to end. Then we come to Elizabeth Stride, who suffered much less severe injuries than the other Whitechapel murder victims. It was presumed that this was because the killer had been interrupted. A report by Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, dated the 19th of October 1888, summarised the police response to this murder and listed the groups upon which they focused their investigation, including lodging house dwellers, slaughtermen, ex-slaughtermen, butchers, ex-butchers, Greek gypsies, cowboys, socialists, sailors, Asiatics in opium dens, but no hint of anyone associated with the medical profession. At the inquest, there was this interesting exchange between Dr. Bagster Phillips and the coroner Wynne Baxter. In this case, as in some others, there seems to have been some knowledge where to cut the throat to cause a fatal result.
Is there any similarity between this case and Annie Chapman's case?
There is a very great dissimilarity between the two. In Chapman's case, the neck was severed all round down to the vertebral column, the vertebral bones being marked with two sharp cuts, and there had been an evident attempt to separate the bones. So Bagster Phillips saw the same degree of anatomical knowledge which allowed the throat vessels to be accurately targeted, but at the same time a great dissimilarity between the throat wounds inflicted on Liz Stride and Annie Chapman. The coroner, in his summing up, stated,
there had been no skillful mutilation as in the cases of Nichols and Chapman, and no unskillful injuries as in the case of in Mitre Square. But there had been the same skill exhibited in the way in which the victim had been entrapped and the injuries inflicted, so as to cause instant death and prevent blood from soiling the operator.
This seems confused as well. The abdominal mutilations performed on Nichols can hardly be described as skillful. They were just cuts, and the injuries suffered by Catherine Eddowes at Mitre Square were not unskillful, although there is some confusion over this, as we shall see. The common denominator seems to be the skill with which the throat was cut. Catherine Eddowes was murdered on the same night as Liz Stride, but in the City of London. She was very severely mutilated and her left kidney and uterus were removed. Chief Inspector Swanson wrote in an internal report
that the mutilation so far give no evidence of anatomical knowledge in the sense that it evidenced the hand of a qualified surgeon. The medical evidence showed that the murder could have been committed by a person who had been a hunter, a butcher, a slaughterman, as well as a student in surgery or a properly qualified surgeon.
Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, the City of London police surgeon, told the inquest,
"I believe the perpetrator of the act must have had considerable knowledge of the position of the organs in the abdominal cavity and the way of removing them. It required a great deal of knowledge to have removed the kidney and to know where it was placed. Such a knowledge might be possessed by someone in the habit of cutting up animals."
Dr. Sequoia was the first doctor on the scene at Mitre Square, and he performed the post-mortem with Dr. Brown. He testified,
"I quite agree with the doctor in every particular. I do not think he was possessed of any great anatomical skill."
Another doctor, William Sedgwick Saunders, the City of London Medical Officer of Health, was present at the post-mortem, and he testified,
"I agree with Dr. Brown and Dr. Sequoia that the wounds were not inflicted by anyone possessing great anatomical skill."
So although Dr. Brown went into greater detail and said a great deal of knowledge was required, both the other two doctors agreed with him, and that agreement was that the perpetrator showed no great medical skill. So we haven't got much clarity there. Surprisingly, none of the doctors involved in examining the body of Mary Jane Kelly, by far the most grotesquely mutilated and the last of the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper, expressed an opinion as to the degree of anatomical knowledge or surgical skill they thought was displayed by the killer. After the murder of Mary Kelly, Dr. Thomas Bond was asked to give his opinion on the medical evidence for Robert Anderson, who was the head of the Criminal Investigation Department at Scotland Yard. Bond was the police surgeon for A Division, Whitehall, which was centred on Scotland Yard. His resulting report is regarded as one of the first attempts ever at profiling what we now call a serial killer. Bond had access to the post-mortem reports of the first 4 murders, and he had personally assisted with that of Mary Kelly, so he was mainly going off written reports, although he also knew most of the other doctors involved. He reported,
"In each case the mutilation was inflicted by a person who had no scientific nor anatomical knowledge. In my opinion, he does not even possess the technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer or any person accustomed to cut up dead animals."
So Bond's opinion was a 180-degree turn away from that of Bagster Phillips. I've seen it suggested that when these doctors denied that the killer showed anatomical knowledge, that they were involved in some sort of cover-up to protect the medical profession from criticism, out of some sort of loyalty to their brother doctors. I think this is very unlikely. In any case, Bond's report was for internal purposes only, and Dr. Bagster Phillips was being publicly quoted very vocally suggesting some sort of medical involvement. The only explanation I can think of is that Bond was effectively Scotland Yard's embedded medico and was, let's say, prone to being influenced by the police, or at least by Robert Anderson, when giving his medical opinion. It's instructive to examine the case of Rose Mylett in some detail, as it sheds some light on to Dr. Bond and his opinions. The papers relating to the investigation into Rose Mylett's death, I'll link below to films where I've covered this, in Poplar on the 20th of December 1888, are held within the overall Whitechapel murder files. The local police divisional surgeon, Dr. Matthew Brownfield, and his assistant, Dr. George Harris, reportedly supported by Bagster Phillips, deemed that Rose Mylett had been strangled, and indeed the verdict of the inquest was that it was a case of
willful murder by person or persons unknown.
Robert Anderson disagreed, believing it to be an accidental death or even natural causes. He even went to the extraordinary length of personally going to view the body in the mortuary himself. this is extraordinary behaviour for an assistant commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. Bond, as I said, was Anderson's preferred doctor, but he was away. So Bond's superior, in fact, Dr. Alexander McKellar, the surgeon-in-chief for the Metropolitan Police, also went to examine the body, and he agreed with the local doctor's findings. Dr. Charles Hebert, who was Bond's assistant, and who I've mentioned in many of the films which I've already done about the Torso murders, also went to the mortuary in lieu of Dr. Bond, and he also agreed with the local doctors. This was not at all agreeable to Anderson. He held a conference at Scotland Yard, and inconveniently Bond, who had by now appeared, agreed with the findings of all the other doctors who had actually seen the body. This wasn't the answer that Anderson required from Bond, so on the 24th of December 1888, Bond was duly, Christmas Eve, Bond was duly sent down to Poplar to check in person. This time, Bond came back with what Anderson deemed to be the right answer, and which was one that was in line with Anderson's opinion.
That though death was due to strangulation, it was produced accidentally and not by homicidal violence.
So death was due to accidental strangulation by Rose Mylett herself. As a consequence, the police refused to investigate the case as murder, irrespective of the findings of the inquest. I've gone into some detail about the Rose Mylett case because it illustrates that Bond would provide reports to Anderson's liking, and I think this is why Bond's profile of the killer came out strongly about the culprit having any
scientific nor anatomical knowledge. He does not even possess the technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer.
Also remember that Bond only saw one Ripper victim, Mary Kelly. Hebert, as his assistant, was also in attendance. Hebert recollected of this murder.
There was nothing to suggest any knowledge of anatomy or surgical skill.
So it must be a real possibility that viewing the destruction done to Mary Kelly's body at Miller's Court coloured Bond's overall judgment. As a postscript to this issue, I think that Anderson didn't want Rose Mylett's death to be attributed or adjudged as a murder, as he wanted the hysteria around the Jack the Ripper murders to be over and done with. It was career-ending, having cost Sir Charles Warren, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, his job a month or so earlier. So what was the opinion of the police in this case? The best way to judge is by looking at the contemporary suspects, some of whom were cleared at the time. I'm only going to assess these suspects' viability based on the likelihood of them having opportunity of acquiring basic anatomical knowledge. I'm not going to comment on their general plausibility of a suspect, well, I might a little bit. Kosminski, and I'm going to base this on Aaron Kosminski, who had briefly worked as a hairdresser, which is nothing like a barber surgeon, as some people try to suggest, incidentally. There's absolutely nothing to suggest he had any anatomical knowledge. He was, of course, Anderson's favoured suspect. Montague Druitt was a school teacher and barrister, but his father was a doctor, so it's plausible he could have obtained some basic anatomical knowledge from that source. Melville Macnaughton, a senior officer at Scotland Yard, wrote an internal memorandum in 1894 in which he wrongly described Druitt as a doctor. I've got a strong suspicion that the reason why Macnaughton got confused over Druitt's profession was because he knew that there was a suggestion that the killer had anatomical knowledge, and he knew that Druitt's father was a doctor, and in his mind he got muddled up, and instead of being a barrister and a school teacher, which were Druitt's actual professions, in Macnaughton's mind Montague Druitt became a doctor. That's my theory anyway. In Macnaughton's memorandum, he listed 3 suspects, in fact. Kosminski, Druitt. The third one was called Michael Ostrog, and in that Macnaughton again incorrectly described Ostrog as a doctor. Modern research has shown that Ostrog was actually in jail in France at the time, which says all you need to know about the police investigation if he was one of the top 3 suspects. Ostrog was a con man who had previously claimed to be a surgeon in the Russian Navy. So in Macnaghten's naive eyes, he could be said to fit the Bagster Phillips target group. Now I'll come to Francis Tumblety. He was what was known as a herb doctor, but would he have had anatomical knowledge? He passed himself off as a fake doctor and plausibly may have least have made some sort of superficial study, but he certainly had no surgical knowledge. But his suspect status at the time might have been enhanced by his fake doctor label. George Chapman or Severin Klosowski was a barber, not a barber surgeon, so he had no plausible connection. William Berry was a wife murderer and a recent arrival in London with no useful connections to give him any plausible opportunity to acquire anatomical knowledge. Joseph Barnett, Mary Kelly's ex-boyfriend, who was interrogated for hours by the police as a suspect for her murder, was a fish porter at Billingsgate Market, meaning in that role he didn't even fillet fish with a knife at work, as some claim. That was a separate job in a very heavily regulated industry. So he has no likely reason to have acquired any anatomical knowledge. James Kelly, the Broadmoor escapee, has no linkages. The police had him as someone to look out for after the murder of Mary Kelly. Thank you for watching so far. Keep watching to the very end, but as I always say in the middle of these films, don't forget to subscribe, share, like and comment below to help the old YouTube algorithms. But carry on, as I say, to the end, plenty more good information to come. Earlier I dwelt on a suggestion by Dr. Bagster Phillips regarding the skill shown by the perpetrator in the Annie Chapman murder. So who came under suspicion during that specific period of the investigation? The following were all cleared one way or another, but it does show you how the police were looking at that time. There was John Pizer, or Leather Apron, who was the lead suspect for the first few weeks after the murder of Polly Nichols. There's no reason to think he had any anatomical or surgical knowledge. Then we come to Jacob Ishensmith, who, while being a mad pork butcher, had no anatomical knowledge as far as humans are concerned. Then we have another man called William Piggott, who had no reason to have anatomical knowledge or surgical skills. There were other individuals who were brought in during this period, none of which had any reason to have, or for the police to even suppose they had, anatomical knowledge or surgical skills, such as Edward McKenna and Charles Ludwig. Then we come to another suspect called Oswald Puckridge, who was
released from an asylum on the 4th of August. He was educated as a surgeon, has threatened to rip people up with a long knife.
Puckridge was actually a chemist, so this is another example of faulty police intelligence. But it does at least suggest that surgeons were specifically being looked at in the aftermath of Annie Chapman's murder, particularly mad ones. Puckridge was actually traced by the City London Police and cleared of all involvement. Incidentally, the Commissioner of the City London Police also mistakenly thought that Puckridge was a medical student. As a sidebar, I'll mention one strange thing about Puckridge. In 1884 and 1885, Puckridge was living in Jersey in the Channel Islands, where he was repeatedly arrested for assaulting people, for being drunk and disorderly, and for being a general nuisance. There he claimed actually to be a medical student, although he was 44 years old at the time. And this might be the source of the misinformation, the misleading claim that Puckridge was a medical student. Initially he gave the name Fussell, but because the more notorious he became, the more arrested he became, they realised his name was Puckridge, and so clearly the subterfuge of trying to pass himself off to the authorities as Fussell became pointless, and then you can see in the reports then he's just referred to as Puckridge. Now the interesting thing is that Fussell was the name, guess what, of his stepfather. I've been told by someone or another that sometimes miscreants use the name of their stepfather when they're trying to avoid facing the consequences of their illegal activities. And often this subterfuge is unsuccessful, as in the case of Puckridge, whose True identity, of course, was found out even though he did try and go under the name of his stepfather. That's what tends to happen. And we also have this from Chief Inspector Swanson's report from Scotland Yard on the 19th of October 1888.
Inquiries were also made to trace 3 insane students who had attended London Hospital. Result: 2 traced, 1 gone abroad.
The 2 who were traced were presumably cleared. The identity of the 3rd man was uncovered, as is shown by this report from Inspector Aberline.
Searching inquiries were made by an officer in Aberdeen Place, St John's Wood, the last known address of the insane medical student called John Sanders, but the only information that he could obtain was that a lady named Sanders resided with her son at number 20, but left there to go abroad about 2 years ago.
Exactly how searching these inquiries are is open to doubt, as it's been established that John Sanders was actually committed to an insane asylum and had not gone abroad at all. And the family lived at 22 Abercorn Place, not 20 Aberdeen Place. As with Ostrog's whereabouts, if nothing else, this illustrates that modern researchers often know much more than the police did at the time, which is, you know, with this case here, couldn't they find out that that this man Sanders was in an insane asylum? Police work was very poor. It's fair to say then, in the aftermath of the Chapman murder, there was some degree of focus on medical suspects, even if they weren't really medical suspects, but it hardly even then dominated the inquiry. In general then, of those we know by name that the police suspected, at least to some degree, most had no surgical skills, and in most instances didn't even have anatomical skills. And unfortunately, most of these presumed anatomical skills or medical knowledge was due to faulty police intelligence rather than reality. So the generality of these suspects, I'll emphasise, shows unequivocally that the police were not looking for a suspect with surgical skills and barely thought that any anatomical knowledge was necessary. But what of the other non-police suspects? Jacob Levy, the Jewish butcher from Middlesex Street, he would obviously cut up dead animal meat, lamb or beef, which doesn't provide any sort of real anatomical knowledge as described. I might as well take the opportunity to rule out Prince Albert Victor as having any reason to have any anatomical knowledge. George Hutchinson as a suspect is a mystery man, so you can make up anything you wish with regard to him. David Cohen or Nathan Kosminski, people keep mentioning them, the alternative Kosminskis, and they have no known connection to anatomical knowledge. Walter Sickert, a famous painter whose candidacy is championed by Patricia Cornwell, has no known connection that would allow him to obtain anatomical knowledge. Frederick Bailey Deeming and James and Michael Maybrick can also be ruled out on these grounds. But the American suspect H.H. Holmes was trained as a doctor and would have had surgical skills perhaps. Robert Mann was an inmate at the Whitechapel workhouse and worked as a mortuary assistant at the Whitechapel mortuary. Accordingly, perhaps he did have the potential to acquire some basic anatomical knowledge, so he might pass that test. Sir William Gull, the royal physician, a traditional suspect for those who favour both the royal and the Masonic conspiracy theories. He obviously had surgical and anatomical skills, so on those criteria he's way up above all the other suspects. Then we have Francis Thompson, the mad poet, who supposedly studied medicine for several years. Probably didn't have surgical skills, but he would have had anatomical knowledge. So this leaves us with Sir William Gull or H.H. Holmes as the prime suspects, with people like Francis Thompson or Robert Mann close behind. What do you make of that? So do you think it's necessary to find a suspect who had surgical skills? I'd suggest no, and I'll get instant agreement on that from those who favour suspects who've got no surgical background, which is nearly all of them. In the sphere of ripperology, you see fairly constant suggestions that the culprit must have had anatomical knowledge. He knew where to cut to achieve near instant death, the vital vessels around the neck. He knew how to strangle quickly to reduce blood flows prior to using his knife. He knew the location of certain organs that he targeted for removal, the uterus, the kidney, for example. Was this knowledge difficult to obtain? And what of Lechmere? I haven't mentioned him at all so far. I'll highlight 3 features. Firstly, I've mentioned Dr. Kahn's Anatomical Museum in several previous films. It was located in the West End, near Piccadilly Circus, on the site of what is now called the Trocadero. For the price of £1, the paying public could go in and see anatomically correct waxwork figures of humans, mostly women, laying down, often with all their internal organs left on display in a manner very reminiscent of how the bodies of Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Kelly were left on display by the killer. This was closed by the police in 1873 as an outrage to public decency. Arguably, anyone who was around and available and were within reach of Dr. Kahn's Anatomical Museum up to 1873 could have viewed this exhibition, but that pretty much excludes nearly all the names I've mentioned so far. Guess who it doesn't exclude? Yes, you're right, the name's on the tip of your tongue. Charles Lechmere, whose wealthy aunts and uncle lived within a very short stone's throw of what is now the Trocadero, Dr. Kahn's Anatomical Museum. This provided him with an excellent opportunity in his youth while visiting his relatives to go and visit Dr. Kahn's Anatomical Museum. Secondly, his family developed a very long-term business relationship with the horse slaughtering cat's meat trade. His mother, Maria Forsdyke, opened what was presumably a successful cat's meat wholesale business from around 1890 to 1902. His son, Thomas Allen Lechmere, was a carman who delivered horseflesh for the cat's meat trade and went on to run a cat's meat stall at Broadway Market in Hackney with his son Thomas Charles Lechmere up to 1943, when both were killed in the Bethnal Green Tube disaster, and thereafter Charles' son Roy took over and continued for a few more years to do cat's meat from Broadway Market. Given their long-standing connection to the horseflesh trade as wholesalers, it's not exactly stretching credibility to suggest that this was going on a little bit prior to the first documented proof that we have of it that involved Charles Lechmere's old ma. Lastly, long-term viewers of this channel will know that I've suggested that Charles Lechmere began his murderous campaign back in 1872 with the murder of Harriet Buswell, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. And this was followed up with the Battersea Torso case of 1873, which I'll again link to below, and subsequent torso cases such as the Rainham mystery of 1887. These and other murders, which I haven't done films about yet, but I will, rest assured I will in due course, will have provided ample opportunity for Lechmere to learn on the job, so to speak. Practice makes perfect. I think that by 1888, Lechmere was already a killer of long standing. What we see in 1888 was someone who knew what he was doing and had the confidence to do it where he did it, in the middle of the street, in the open, skillfully, swiftly and surely. And that, by the way, just happens to be the motto of the Worshipful Company of Carmen. Contrary to all the noise you can probably hear in the background, it's not the 5th of November. but there is a lot of fireworks going up. So in my opinion, these three elements provided ample opportunity for Charles Alan Lechmere, almost uniquely from all these suspects we've had under discussion, to have acquired the requisite anatomical knowledge to carry out these crimes, as I say, almost uniquely amongst all these suspects. Now, I've been quite hard on the police during this film, pointing out various failings in their investigation, with Ostrog, Puckeridge and Sanders, for example. Also, they very largely ignored the advice of the medical profession that the culprit should have had some sort of anatomical knowledge. In serial killer investigations, particularly one where the crimes happen in very quick succession, such as the Jack the Ripper case, the police invariably suffer from information overload. Before they get to grips with one murder, processing the witnesses, tracing the antecedents of the victim, and following up all these leads, the next murder occurs, and the next, and the next, and they get overwhelmed. In the immediate aftermath of the murder of Annie Chapman, there seems to have been a small degree of focus in treating suspects with a perceived degree of medical knowledge seriously, but this soon disappeared. But what do you think? Thank you for watching. As always, please subscribe, share, like and comment below. Shadow cold as stone, but his name cuts through the bone.